America's walking around completely normal. There's no even mention of the word. What's it called? Corona. But in here they're all nuts.
No, there's only people in the government that are nuts. Everybody's normal, nobody cares.
Right. Okay, so what you're doing, this and this simultaneously, stereo reading?
What?
You're doing stereo reading?
Yes.
Where are you going to?
We're going to be opening here, page 94.
What about this?
No, we're going to finish in a second.
Oh, okay. From which section? There's 94 all over the place.
Yeah. Well, this one. I mean, this one. No, sorry. This one. Yeah. Sorry, this one. Okay. So let's finish here, and then we'll see how the Alter Rebbe developed this. So again, this is early on. I don't know from when. I wasn't able to. This is before his incarceration for sure, but I don't remember exactly what year. So what did we ended? We ended with the mashal that he began to give, what a tzelem is. Okay? So let's read it again.
Somebody's playing his electric guitar.
כמו שהתינוק, right?
Yeah.
כמו שהתינוק יחשוק לנגן בכלי שיר, להיות כי במידתו עצמית יש בה תענוג מן ערבות כל הכינור, שהוא גדלות המוחין. So this child, he wants to play a violin because what he's looking for is the music, because he understands the pleasure in the music. That is relatively gadlut mochin. To really take the pleasure from the music, that's already a well-developed mind. Okay, the mochin here is like the mind. ובקטנותו חשקו לעשות כינור מן העצים ולנגן עליו בלי שישמע קול. ולא יהיה בחשקו כלל לטובת כל הכינור אף שישמע. He says, but when he's a little boy, he takes like a piece of wood and he makes believe like he's playing a violin, even though there's no sound coming out and he can't tune it. He can't even make any sound. He can't even make a sound. So what's going on? So in the child's mind, this is what it means to play a violin. So he's saying something very interesting. On the one hand, that being drawn to the violin is because he has a more mature mindset, that he understands the pleasure in the violin, but in terms of his mind, he can't wrap his head around the concept of an actual violin and that it actually is what makes the sound. He doesn't connect that. What he sees is that you make these motions and the sound's supposed to come out. As far as he's concerned, he's making the motions, and in his mind, it's as if he's hearing the. Now that can be, by the way, a very advanced technique. There are composers, most composers in fact, they don't need to hear the actual music. They can do it in their mind. But we're not talking about that. We're not talking about somebody who's well advanced and can do that. We're talking about a little child. So what's going on here? That the mind is not yet developed enough in order to connect the pleasure that he understands, right, because he's heard the violin before, he's heard the music. Then he chaps that, he gets that, but he can't connect it to what he's seen. That when the music came out, you made these sounds, you made these motions. Sorry.
I didn't just say that he knows very well that it's not going to make music, and it's just make believe. It's play.
So why is he doing that?
Play,
So what is that?
Childish
So
play.
what is that? What is that he's saying? He's saying that's an initial tzedem. That's an initial image that the brain has, that the mind has. The mind doesn't yet know how to fully connect these two things. So it's got the pleasure above, and it's got the emotions of the body below, and it's trying to connect it, but it doesn't really know how to. And you could argue that that's the same issue like with the Stradivari or Stradivarius violin, that you understand the music that you get from it, and you understand that the person is playing the way he normally plays. But there's something about the violin itself, the way it's made, that your mind doesn't yet know how to connect fully. So, they've tried to reverse engineer them and all kinds of things, and still they claim that they can't get the same sound that an original will make. So that's saying that the mind is not yet, it hasn't been able to bridge the gap between the pleasure and between the expertise, the artisanship in playing the violin. There's something missing in that gap, so we don't know. So we say that Stradivarius had a better mind. We don't claim, sometimes you say he has better materials, but they try to mimic the materials, and maybe it's the glue, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. But in the end, he had a better mind. He had a better understanding of how it is that you make the violin so that it makes the sound that he wants, and not something else. So this is really a very initial exploration of the Alter Rebbe's of this topic of the tzelem. So it's the beginning, but you already see where it's going to go. That the mind here is what the tzelem is feeding. So as you developmentally, you get more and more tzlamim. That was the entire point. That the tzelem is like an image of the neshama above. That's what we saw before, because that's why it's a tzelem. But it acts here, as he explains it, as some kind of intermediary. Okay? ובזה הובן, כל זמן שמזכין, דעתו מיושבת עליו. So now he's going to switch the language entirely, and he's going to say, as a person matures, as he gets older, what we mean by older is that his da'at, his consciousness, becomes more tranquil. Miyushav. What do we mean by miyushav? So the simple meaning is that he's just more mellowed. Right? He doesn't get excited so much, and so on. But that's the simple meaning, and it's true. That's what they mean. That's what the sages meant by this statement. But the Alter Rebbe is taking it in a different direction. He says, Perush, or at least he's explaining it, how this happens. שנכנסים המוחים מבחינת פנימיות ביותר, עד שהדעת שהיה לו מקווה הוא בחינת צלם ודוגמה של הדעת של עכשיו. There's an amazing thing he says here. That as more and more mind enters the brain, let's call it, then the new knowledge, or it's hard to call it exactly knowledge. It's more like, again, like a conceptual scheme. It's like how you see things. Again, an understanding that you have. The consciousness that you're harboring inside. It becomes more inner, meaning that the tzlamim here, they go from the outside in. We already saw this actually once, but the tzelem starts from something that's far away and doesn't seem very connected to the lower realm. Meaning, in the case of the child, we understand that he understands what the music is, but what he does is not very connected to the lower aspect of actually producing the music. Because this idea of just taking a block of wood and making as if you're playing it, that's very far, that's very distant from the actual, what you actually need to do. Think about life. You sort of get the point, but you don't know how to get to it. You know where you want to go. Let's say when we were 18 or 20. And so, let's say somebody wants to open a business when he's 20. So he has sort of like a fantasy about how it works. And he doesn't see all the paperwork. He doesn't see that aspect of it. He thinks running a business is very great. It's like it's this and that. But what he doesn't see in front of him is all the actual paperwork that he's going to have to do. So he goes and jumps into it, and then slowly he learns that, wait a minute, this is not as romantic as I thought it was. The same thing happens basically with everything. So there's a gap between the pleasure that I think I'm going to get, and the practice that needs to be actually done. And that gap is what the tzelem, what these images begin to fill. And they fill it from the outside in, meaning at the beginning they fill it something that's closer to the pleasure. And as you mature, they begin to fill in until you reach the actual practice that needs to be done. And so that's the maturation of the mind. And each time that you come closer to the actual practice, what was outside, what was further towards the pleasure, call it, that begins to seem to you like an image. Meaning it's amorphous. Because, yeah, it captured some of the idea, but it's not close enough to the actual practice for me to consider it practical. It's not. So it's like an image. It's like a fleeting image that I used to have of what this was about. From the level of the pleasure all the way into the practice. In your understanding, in the mind that's entered into you, are you fully able to have the wisdom involved? When we say that someone's wise, the pleasure and between the practice.
Then you become old enough to close the door when you come into the room?
No, they're not old enough. Give me a chance to get up. Okay, so let's end it. V'zeu Avraham Zaken, Kedesiv, when he got older, he became old. That's what it means that Abraham was old. העלה כל הדוגמאות של בחינת קטנות וגדלות. What it really means is that he took all the images that he used to have and he connected them to the practice. Meaning it became a continuum.
It's called maturity.
It's a continuum. וכן בעבודת השם, now he says, and he's saying all this was just to explain like human nature. The same thing he says is in serving God. צריך להיות הלוך ונסוע, שמעשה עבודתו של שנה שעברה יהיה בבחינת קטנות ודוגמה לגבי שנה, meaning מעשה עבודתה שבשנה זו. He says that it means that a person should constantly be revisiting what he did last year, what he thought last year, and see it. You should be advanced enough that you should see it as that was only an image of what needed to be done. That was only an image of what I understand now. A person should constantly be striving to deepen his understanding. To deepen understanding means that you can bring it to more and more practice. That's what it means that he was whole in his days. That all his days were complete, meaning all the tzlamim, all the knowledge came down, all the understanding came down. Now, so this was an early version of this. In Likutei Torah, Parshas Bechukosai, page 47c, there's the more mature article on this, the more mature essay. Why did you suddenly change when you were in the right place?
No.
Why did you move?
As you said, page 47, before you turned it to 98.
Yeah, you were in the right place. You were in the right place.
This is page 94. A second ago you said 47.
And on the other side, it's 47, folio 47, side C. Anyway, here he starts like this. Mivoar be'etz chaim. It's explained in the Eitz Chaim, in the Arizal. Shar kafei perek
Where are you?
שער כ"ה פרק א', המתחיל עניין הצלם והאמיתית. נראה לי עניות דעתי וכו'. So in Gate 25, chapter 1 of the Eitz Chaim, this is another one of these Maimarim that starts directly from the Kabbalah. You can't learn this without learning the Kabbalah. You have to understand what the Arizal said. B'chinat Tzelem, there he explains what Tzelem is. So a Tzelem, we sort of learned this. It's called Kol Tzameh. The acronym is Kol Tzameh. Kaf Lamed Tzadik Mem Aleph. What do they stand for? Kelim Levushim Tzlamim Mochin Orot.
We've had this before.
So we've seen it before. That's one of the Arizal's more advanced. It's not like Shamla. We learned Shoresh Nefesh Guf Levush Eichad. Something they're similar in a way. This is talking only about the connection, because you see that the two extremes are kelim and orot. So it's just what it means that a light enters into a vessel. And so the Arizal says it's not that simple. There's actually 3 stages in between. There are 3 levels in between the lights and the vessels. And they're called levushim, tzlamim, mochim. Levushim are garments, then tzlamim, what we've been talking about, the images, and then the mochim, the minds. There's no, I don't know if you can do plural in English for a mind. What we mean by that is nefesh hasichlit. That's what we mean by the intellectual soul. The intellectual soul is constantly growing. How is it growing? That day by day, you come from a more abstract understanding to a more practical understanding. Specifically between what and what? שהוא בחינת נפש השיחית המחבר הצורה והחומר, שהוא נפש האלוקית עם נפש הבהמית. He says, this whole topic of tzlamim is what connects the divine soul with the animal soul. What does that mean? It means, what does it mean that Nefesh Sichli does this? This is the whole purpose of Chabad. That's why he called it Chabad. Because the divine soul has a concept of godliness that is ingrained in it. The animal soul has no concept of godliness. It only has a concept of itself and its surroundings. And now you want to bridge the gap. Because it's not a very good thing to live completely divided in yourself. Why? Because one of the two will win. It'll either be that you'll live an entirely divine life and have no connection to worldly matters, or you'll live entirely an animal life and you won't have any connection to divine matters, to supernal matters. What's the result? The result is that people are one or the other. It comes the Torah and says, I want to bridge the gap. The Torah is the original intellectual mind. It comes and says, I want to bridge the gap between the divine and between the human, between the animal soul and the divine soul. But what can we do? That the Torah is too high. The Torah is like lights. And these lights, they're not, again, it's like the child, in a certain sense, it's like the child who's playing this make-believe violin. Because people don't understand. So what is the connection to what the Torah says? Even for us, it's even the sages now. What's the connection to what the sages said and my actual practice in life? How do these two even connect? How do you bridge the gap? It seems to me like these are these very, very high things that are being said, but I don't feel anything like that. So I have to reinterpret it. I have to explain it. I have to get the keys to the kingdom. I have to understand how do you interpret what the sages said in such a way that my animal soul will understand what we're talking about. In other words, so that I will be making music and not just imagining the sound of the violin and making believe that I'm playing on some block of wood. Because that's what most people look like. You're trying to create a divine life, and you're playing, and you're like a child who's playing a block of wood and expecting music to come out. So you're not stupid because you've heard the music, you understand that something like that creates the music, but you feel that I have no connection to this. How is this going to work for me? I don't see it. So the tzlamim, their purpose is to bridge the gap between the divine soul that understands godliness, that has a feeling of the godliness, and the animal soul that only feels the mundane. Only if it's not physical music, it's not at such an advanced level that even, right, like I said, like a really good composer, he doesn't actually have to hear the music. A normal person has to hear the music. He has to feel that this speaks to him. That yes, my animal soul is now moved in some way. Okay? So he says that's what these tzlamim are. They're the nefesh hasichli. They're the intellectual soul. Chabad is the intellectual soul. Chabad is going to say in this mimer that we'll see, God willing, tomorrow we'll see some more of it. was going to say, is the study of bringing these images down into the mind. And every year, you should have a deeper understanding, bridging the gap even more between the divine and the mundane, between the divine and the animal. So, don't put it in there. Because, okay, you know what, leave it there.
Let's tell them.
Yes, let's.
It's 8:15.
When does that stop us?
It's 8:30. Tomorrow I'm davening first, and I'm coming here. Then I'm going to Tel Aviv.
Okay.
7:30.